Perfect. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I'm a senior associate with Scott Legal PC in New York City. A few housekeeping items before we get started. I'd like to start by just saying what I think sets our firm apart, which is the fact that our founder, Ian Scott, actually navigated the process of a TN visa himself. So the fact that he has navigated that process really does inform the way that we work with our clients. Ian not only has navigated the TN visa, but also the E2 visa, the H-1B, as well as an F1 student visa. And we really do take that personal experience into the way that we work with our clients. What we're talking about today, the TN visa, is a business visa. It is a work visa. And though our firm does focus on business and work visas, we actually do handle the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law, whether that's marriage-based green cards, student visas, visitor visas, whether it's litigation against the government. So we really do hope that if you are navigating any aspect of U.S. immigration law, we are happy to help. We do hope that you'll set up a consultation. If you have a question during the presentation, please do send those in either through the chat function or the Q&A function on Zoom. I have both panels open on my computer. I am monitoring both. I'll probably save questions for the end, but I do hope you won't hesitate to send those in. This webinar is part of a series. We try to do at least 2 webinars a week, and those do range. They cover a variety of immigration topics. So we do hope that you sign up for future webinars. After this presentation, you'll receive an email where there will be a link where you can sign up for our future webinars. We will also send you the PowerPoint presentation that you see on screen, so there's no need to take extensive notes. You will get the PowerPoint presentation. In that email, we'll also send you a link to our YouTube channel. We're very proud to put very high quality information on our YouTube channel for free, so we really do hope that you'll check that out. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in talking about the TN visa. And let me start by saying that the TN visa really is when someone comes to us and they have a passport from Canada or Mexico, the TN visa really is one of the first options we're going to look at. If they have a job offer in the U.S. or if they're looking to work in the U.S. And they have that passport from Canada or Mexico, there are few options that are as easy, as fast, as streamlined as the TN. So we'll talk about why in this presentation. So how do you qualify for a TN visa? Well, the TN was established under NAFTA. So it is a treaty, it is considered a treaty visa between the US, Canada, and Mexico. So to qualify for a TN, you do need that passport from either Canada or Mexico. You do not need to have been born in Canada or Mexico. As an example, we have many clients who were born, for example, in China or in India, and they've naturalized in Canada. So they now have Canadian passports, and they do qualify for the TN. They meet that nationality requirement. The second requirement is that your profession must appear on the list of professions provided in the TN regulations. So what in the world does that mean? Well, if you're at your computer, I do recommend that you go ahead and Google NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, TN regulations. I'll do the same right now. In our presentations, we usually don't have our audience pull up regulations because they can be very complicated, but the TN regulations are not complicated, and in fact, they're very helpful, which is why I recommend that you pull them up. So when you actually load those regulations, you scroll down, what you see is a list of professions. It starts with accountant, then architect, computer systems analyst. You scroll down, you see economist, engineers, research assistants, social workers, and then medical professions such as dentists, dietitians, scientists, agriculturists, teachers, college teachers, seminary or university teachers. So there really are dozens of professions on the list of professions in the TN regulations. Now, unfortunately, even though there are dozens of professions, there are some that are not on the list. So if you are someone who works in marketing, that is a very common area where there really aren't any good fits in terms of the TN professions. So you may need another visa, or you may need to look at whether your job duties align with another profession that's on the list. But anyway, the takeaway is there are dozens of professions, but step one is really making sure that the job you're coming to the U.S. to perform appears on the list of professions in the TN regulations. Next, you must have the required qualifications to practice that profession. So what do we mean by that? What we mean again is this is in the regulations. So when I say you need to meet the qualification, it is what the regulations say you need to qualify. All right, so let's take an easy example. If you look at economist in the regulations, you qualify by having either a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. That's the only way you can qualify as an economist on a TN visa, a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. So if you have that degree, you meet the requirements for the regulations. If you don't have that degree, but you have 30 years of experience as an economist, you do not qualify. Even if you're a world-renowned expert in economics, you need the degree to qualify for the TN. Let's compare that to accountant. Accountants, if you look at the regulations, it says baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, or a professional license, CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. So an accountant can qualify either through the degree or the professional license. Let's look at one other example, which is management consultants. So management consultants can qualify based on a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree, or equivalent professional experience as established by a statement of professional credential attesting to 5 years of experience as a management consultant, or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So management consultant, to boil that down, that means either you need a degree or you need 5 years of experience either as a management consultant or in a field of specialty that's related to the agreement you have with the U.S. employer, what you're going to be doing in the U.S. So you see from these examples I've shared that the TN regulations require that you qualify for a given profession. You first have to find your profession, and then you need to see what the qualification requirement is according to your profession. And that qualification requirement is either going to be a degree, a professional license, or professional experience. And again, you need to look at the profession, because even though a management consultant can qualify based on experience, an economist cannot. Even though an accountant can qualify based on a professional license, an economist cannot. So it really is figure out what profession you're coming to the U.S. to work in, figure out how you qualify, make sure you meet that qualification. So what if your employer, let's go back to the economist example, what if your employer says, we're only going to hire someone if they have 20 years of experience as an economist? That's fine, but that requirement is separate from the TN visa requirement. So again, for the TN visa, you want to emphasize for an economist that you have the degree. If the employer then also wants 20 years of experience, then you can say in the application, you can say, not only does this person qualify for the visa by having a degree, they're also the ideal person for this job because they have 20 years of experience. So you want to separate those two things, how you qualify for the visa versus how you qualify based on the employer's requirements. That's very important. It's important because government officials get confused about this. So if, for example, you were to apply as an economist and you have 20 years of experience, and in your application you emphasize, I have 20 years of experience, I'm a world-renowned economist, all this experience, but you're not clear that you have the degree, you may very well be denied. So you want to put front and center for the officer. What the officer is looking at is a checklist. What is the profession? Economist. Okay, how do you qualify as an economist? Degree. Do they have the degree? If they see 20 years of experience, they might not notice you have the degree. So you want to put that degree front and center and show how you qualify for the TN. So the next requirement is you need to have a prearranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the U.S. So what does this mean? When you apply for the TN visa, you actually need a job offer in hand. If the TN visa is approved, you need to be ready to come into the U.S. and start working immediately. You cannot use the TN visa to look for a job. For that, a B1 visa might be a good option. ESTA might be a good option for someone who has ESTA. But A B1 visa for nationals of Canada or Mexico is typically going to be the option for that, not a TN. Again, the TN is when you have a job offer in hand and you're coming into the U.S. to work. And what qualifies as an employer? Well, fortunately, an employer is very broadly defined. So it could be a corporation in the U.S., it could be an LLC in the U.S., it could be a sole proprietorship. As an example, if there were an attorney in the U.S., one person who has a law firm, and they wanted to hire an attorney from Canada to come into the U.S. to work for them, that could work. That's a U.S. employer, even though it's one person, a sole proprietor, that's fine. And lawyers qualify for a TN as long as you meet the qualifications. But you do need that employer in the U.S., and that employer does need to have extended a job offer to the person applying for the TN. Next, in the job that you'll be performing in the U.S., you must be employed to engage in professional activities consistent with the listed profession. So what does that mean? What that means is if you're coming into the U.S. to practice a certain profession, a certain TN profession, you actually need to perform job duties that are performed by someone in that profession. In other words, I mentioned before that people who work in marketing typically have a hard time getting a TN because there's no marketer role listed in the regulations. But let's say you have a degree in economics. So you went to college, you have a degree in economics, and an employer in the U.S. says, hey, we'll hire you, we'll give you the job title of an economist, but as soon as you come in, you're going to do our marketing work. That's going to be a problem. And that's going to be a problem because the job duties need to be those of an economist, not those of a marketer. How do you know what the government thinks an economist does? This is the second Google search I'm going to recommend, which is Google OOH, which stands for Occupational Outlook Handbook, economist. And I'm just going to use economist as an example because it's an easy one. So economist, Occupational Outlook Handbook. And in fact, let's go to the next slide, which shows, I'll come back to this one. The next slide actually shows a screenshot of this, which is here. So if you look, this is the page, Occupational Outlook Handbook for economists. And if you click this tab, what they do, the second tab. So I'm going to click it as well. What it shows is a list of job duties. And it says economists typically do the following. They research economic issues. They conduct surveys, collect data, analyze that data using mathematical and statistical tools and models. They interpret and forecast trends. They advise businesses, governments, and individuals on problems related to fiscal policy or other economic topics, and they present their research. And then it has more details. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but the Occupational Outlook Handbook is published by the U.S. government, by the Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it represents the government's perspective on what a given profession does. So you really can search OOH, and then you'd put any of the professions, whichever profession you plan to work in, whether it's dentist, whether it's social worker, management consultant, economist. You'd want to put it into the OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook, look at the job duties, and make sure you're going to be doing the job duties in the U.S. that are listed in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. If your employer wants you to be doing job duties that are different from the Occupational Outlook Handbook, you need to have a conversation with them. We're happy to, if you want to work with us, we're happy to have that conversation with the employer. It's something we do quite regularly. They need to align those job duties from what they had in mind to something aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook. If they don't, there's a high risk of denial. There's a high risk that the officer will deny the application. So you do want to align those job duties. And again, these actually need to be the job duties you're performing in the U.S. You never want to present to the government information that is misleading or inaccurate that could cause issues down the road. Or at the moment, it could bar you from a future benefit or the current benefit you're applying for. So be honest, but also work with the employer to align those job duties with what the regulations have in mind. So the last requirement that you see on your screen is that your degree must match the job description. This is only if you're qualifying based on education. If you're qualifying, say, as a management consultant based on experience, this is irrelevant. You don't need a degree. So this doesn't matter. If you're qualifying based on a professional license, this does not matter. But if you're qualifying based on a degree, the degree needs to be in the field of the profession. So let's take an example. If you are applying as an economist, the only way you can qualify as an economist is a degree, baccalaureate or licenciatura. And I will just say a higher degree is fine. So if you have, let's say your undergrad degree is in French, then you got a master's in economics. That's okay. Let's say your undergrad's in French, your master's is in French, and then you got a PhD in economics. That's fine. So when the regulations say you need a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree in a field, a degree higher than baccalaureate or licenciatura is okay. But the degree does need to be in a related field. So let's say you only have an undergraduate degree, you only have a baccalaureate degree, you're applying as an economist, but your degree is in, let's say, finance, or your degree is in math. We would say those are related fields. Those are fields that are related to economics. It's best if you have an economics degree, but if you have a math degree or you have a finance degree, they are pretty clearly related to economics, so there's a basis to make the argument. You would argue in your application that your degree is in a related field and that your coursework prepared you to work as an economist. So what you do in your application is not only include your degree in finance or math, for example, you'd also include your transcript, and you'd go through your transcript and find all classes, all coursework that's related to economics, and you'd emphasize that in the application, in the written application. You'd explain, my degree is in math. As part of that curriculum, I took classes in econometrics, in whatever it is, statistics, whatever is related to your work as an economist. And you'd argue it that way. The other thing you can do, if your degree is related, is go back to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, because there is a tab next to what they do. If you look at the top of your screen, the fourth tab is how to become one. And if you read that section, this can actually really help in these applications, is if you look at the education section, let's just look here. It says, candidates who have a bachelor's degree with sufficient course credits in economics, statistics, or math, or mathematics, may qualify for some entry-level economist positions. That language is extremely helpful for you. If your degree is in math, and you are saying, I'm applying for a TN visa for an economist, but my degree's in math, you can quote this language and say, hey, the Occupational Outlook Handbook says that a degree in math can be sufficient for an economist job. And again, government officials are typically going to defer to the Occupational Outlook Handbook because it is an official government publication. So check out that tab if you have a related degree. But let's say that your degree is not related. Let's say you have that undergrad, that baccalaureate degree in French, and you're applying to work as an economist. That is going to be a really challenging application. It could be approved. Here's how you'd want to frame the application. You'd want to go to your transcript, see if you took any classes in economics, and you'd want to emphasize those courses. You also might want to go to your independent research if you wrote a thesis that was related to economics. I'm continuing with the economist example, but you can change the example depending on the profession you want to enter in. If you want to enter as an economist, did you do independent research in economics? Did you write a thesis on economics? If you worked with a professor, maybe during the summer, that is in the field of economics, could you get a letter from that professor saying that even though your degree is in French, you did significant work in economics? Another thing we've done in the past is go to the university and actually have a department chair or a dean from the university write a letter that says that even though the degree is, for example, in French, the coursework prepared the person for a career in economics or whatever the profession is. So you want to think creatively, use those resources, whether they be deans, professors, the transcript, the thesis, use them to your advantage. At the end of the day, though, if your degree is not related, you really are facing an uphill battle. So you really do have to overcome that weakness in the application. So we just talked about this screen. This is the Occupational Outlook Handbook, a wonderful resource that I do recommend you search depending on which profession you want to come in and work in. This slide is addressing what is probably the most common question we get related to the TN visa, which is, does a TN visa require sponsorship? Now, the reason that this question comes up a lot is that in U.S. immigration, employment-based immigration, whether it's an H-1B, whether it is an employment-based green card, employers typically need to meet a number of requirements, and these are expensive and these are time-consuming requirements. These requirements don't apply to the TN. So just to right off the bat answer the question, we would say that a TN visa does not require sponsorship. It does not require sponsorship. Many U.S. employers are concerned about this because they want to know, do I need to sponsor this person? So what do they have in mind when they're saying, do I need to sponsor this person? So for an H-1B and for many employment-based green cards, the first thing a U.S. employer has to do is advertise the job in the U.S. and see if there's a U.S. worker who's qualified and able to accept the job. And if there is, the employer needs to offer the job to a U.S. worker. For the TN, you don't have to do that. You do not have to advertise the job to U.S. workers. Also, in the context of H-1B and employment-based green cards, you may need to pay a prevailing wage, which is higher than minimum wage. You don't have to do that for a TN. TN, as long as you're paying minimum wage, you're fine. There's not a requirement, a legal requirement that you pay higher. Of course, you do want to pay the going rate, and that is because optically, it's going to look very strange if you're hiring an economist and you're paying them $7.25, whatever minimum wage is now, to do their work. Economists earn more than minimum wage. So you do want to pay the going rate for someone given their experience, but there's no legal requirement that you pay a prevailing wage as there are for other visa types. There are other requirements that apply to the H-1B and to employment-based green cards. If the person is terminated, the employer sometimes has to pay for their travel back to their home country. There sometimes is a benching requirement that if you bring someone in on an H-1B, for example, you actually have to give them active labor. You can't, put them on leave for a little while. None of that applies to a TN. A TN, the way to think about a TN is it is basically just having an at-will employee. The only difference is they have a passport from Canada or Mexico, but if they come in TN status, they have a TN visa, they're authorized to work for you if they have that approval for your company. And there are no additional requirements that come with sponsorship. Again, they are at will, meaning if they need to be fired, you can fire them. If they want to quit, they can quit. So they typically are at will unless your contract says otherwise. But it is quite straightforward because employers can think of a TN employee as they would any other at-will employee. Quickly, last two bullet points. Filing for a TN at a port of entry versus with USCIS. We will talk about this in much greater detail, but basically the reason this is on this slide is there are two main pathways to apply for a TN. One is from outside the U.S., and that's through a consulate, or for Canadians, a port of entry. Within the U.S., Canadians or Mexicans who are inside the U.S. can apply for a change of status through USCIS. The reason this is on this slide is that the entity that signs the application depends on where the person's applying. So if you are applying outside the U.S., if you're applying at a consulate or you're applying at a port of entry, then it is the employee applicant who's filing the application. So if the application is denied, it is the applicant's application that is denied. It is not the employer's application that is denied. From within the U.S., applications submitted to USCIS, that is the employer that files that application. So if there's a denial, it is the employer's application. And this is actually really beneficial to the employee because what it means is, let's say you're in the U.S. as a student, an F1 student, and you apply to change to TN status to work for a company, and it's denied. That means that you still have your F1 status. You never filed the application. So if it's denied, you still have your F1 status. You can still study as long as your F1's valid because it's the employer's denial. So that's why that's on the screen. It's a bit of a technicality, but employers, it is relevant. I mean, applying through USCIS, the employer would sign the forms, but that doesn't change their requirements. They still are not sponsoring the employee. They still do not have to pay a prevailing wage, do not have to advertise the job to U.S. workers. It is really just that technically the application is filed by the employer if it's filed through USCIS from within the U.S. All right, so continuing on this theme of differences for Canadian and Mexican nationals, I briefly mentioned this. Really, the main difference is that nationals of Canada can apply for a TN at a port of entry, whether that's an airport or a land crossing. This is extremely convenient. Nationals of Canada can really have their TN application and they can go to an international airport, whether it's Pearson, whether it's Vancouver, Toronto, whatever airport, and they can apply for the visa in person. They can also do it by land. So if they're crossing Peace Bridge or Rainbow Bridge, whatever it is, they would bring their TN application and apply as they're crossing the border. So it is an instant decision. It's a brief conversation with the immigration officer, typically no more than 10 minutes or so, and you get an immediate decision. So that is extremely convenient for nationals of Canada. It's also inexpensive. Nationals of Mexico cannot apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico, if they're outside the U.S., must apply at a consulate. So they would file a DS-160 form online. When the consulate is ready to interview them, the applicant would go to the consulate, interview, and then they'd actually get a TN visa in their passport. Once they have that visa, they can enter the U.S. and work for the U.S. employer. For Canadians and Mexicans who are inside the U.S., they can apply through USCIS, and they would apply for what's called a change of status. So if they're in the U.S., they have some status, whether that's as a visitor or a student, whatever it is. They would apply to change their status to TN status. Again, that is the employer technically filing that application. So this is done by filing a Form I-129. There is an option to expedite this application. The fee is about $3,000, so it's not cheap, though it will guarantee a decision in 15 business days. If you don't pay that expedite fee, you are looking at a number of months before you get a decision on that application. But those are the three ways you can apply for a TN. Port of entry, only for Canadians. Consulates, for Canadians or Mexicans, although Canadians will rarely use that option because they can use a port of entry. And from within the U.S. through USCIS. Now, I mentioned Canadians will rarely apply at a consulate, but there are circumstances where they might. So, Customs and Border Protection, only people who have a passport from Canada, a Canadian passport, can apply at a port of entry. So let's say that you are Canadian, you have a Canadian passport, but your spouse has an Indian passport. Your spouse would have to apply at the consulate. They could not apply at a port of entry. So for that reason, typically the principal applicant would also join them at the consulate. That also goes for children as well. The children need Canadian passports if they're going to apply at a port of entry. You can get TN dependent status, which is called TD status, even if you don't have a Canadian or a Mexican passport, as long as the principal is eligible for TN. So again, if the principal has a Canadian passport, but the spouse has a Chinese passport and the children have Chinese passports, all of them can have TN status. The principal would have TN principal status. The dependents would have TN dependent status, which is called TD status. They would not be able to work, but they could come into the U.S., enter and exit, and they could study in the U.S. If you get a visa at a consulate, it's typically issued for 3 years if you are Canadian. If you're Mexican, you have the benefit of getting a 4-year visa by paying a little bit extra, though it's usually worth the money. It saves you a frequent trip to the consulate. So you can get a 4-year TN visa as a national of Mexico. Each time you enter the U.S., though, you're typically given 3 years of TN status. So even if your visa is valid for 4 years, when you enter the U.S., you're only given 3 years of status in the U.S. What that means is you need to leave the U.S. before your status expires. But if your visa is valid, you can come right back in once you've left the US because you have a valid TN visa. All right, so now we're going to shift gears a bit and we're going to talk about two professional categories that are particularly challenging for TN visas. So at the beginning of this presentation, we looked at the TN regulations and we saw that there were dozens of professions listed. We've been talking about economists. I mentioned management consultants. Those are actually two of the most challenging categories, and let's talk about why. Management consultants, this category is challenging because it is one of the only professional categories that allows you to qualify with no degree. So if you don't have a baccalaureate degree or a licenciature degree, you could still qualify as a management consultant based on 5 years of experience, either as a management consultant or in the field of specialty that's related to your consulting agreement. Okay, so if someone doesn't have a degree, the government knows that they are almost certainly going to apply as a management consultant because they don't qualify for any other profession, regardless of whether they're actually going to work as a management consultant in the US. So the government scrutinizes these applications. They know it's a catch-all category for those who don't have a degree. Now, before going further, I want to quickly say there is a spectrum here. Not all management consultant applications are necessarily challenging or risky. At the easy end of the spectrum, those applications that are fairly straightforward, easy to get approved, are those where the person is coming into the US to work for a management consulting firm. So let's say that you have a degree in business management or you have 5 years of experience working for McKinsey in Mexico City, and you're coming to the US to work for McKinsey in New York. That's going to be a straightforward application because you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm, whether it's McKinsey, BCG, Bain, you name it. If you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm, these applications are not particularly challenging or risky. There's not a high denial rate. What is challenging is when you're coming into the US to work as a management consultant for a company that is not a management consulting firm. The example I like to use is, let's say there's a company in the US that designs and manufactures solar panels. And you are an expert in solar panels. You are national of Mexico, and in Mexico you've been working for over a decade. You're seen as an expert on solar panels, and this US company wants you to come from Mexico to the US to advise them on improving their manufacturing process and their design of solar panels. That's an example where you're not coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. You're coming to the US to work for a solar panel company. That would be a challenging application, but there are ways to get it approved. What you would want to do in those applications is think about what a typical consulting arrangement looks like, and you'd want to make sure that your arrangement with the US company looks like that. Now again, when I say it looks like that, it actually needs to be that way. So it's not okay to just present something that you don't intend to follow. Everything I'm about to say actually needs to be what the intention is on the ground. So what does a typical consulting agreement look like? Well, first of all, if a company, for example, hires McKinsey, they are usually not going to put that McKinsey consultant on payroll, right? A McKinsey consultant who's hired by Walmart is usually not going to make the McKinsey consultant a W-2 paid employee. That consultant's not going to fill a permanent role at Walmart. They're going to be contracted with McKinsey, and McKinsey's going to send them in to analyze a very specific challenge that Walmart is facing. The consultant's going to gather data, observe, analyze the data, make recommendations to Walmart's management, and then they're out. And McKinsey's going to be paid based on the deliverables. Our consultant reviewed your data, our consultant analyzed your data, presented the data and recommendations to Walmart's management, and that's what Walmart is paying for. So, in our example with the solar panel company, it would have a very high risk of denial if the solar panel company said this national of Mexico, who's a specialist in solar panels, is going to come to our company. We're going to put him on W-2 payroll. He's going to fill a role that has existed at our company for a long time, and he's going to be here for 3 years, helping us with our operations. The reason that's likely to fail is, again, that doesn't look like a consulting agreement. So instead of doing that, it would be good for the U.S. company, the solar panel company, to have a contract either with the consultant directly or with the consultant. If the consultant has an employer in Mexico who's going to contract with the U.S. company, that's possible too. But let's say there's no company in Mexico contracting him out. It's just the consultant, just the individual. There could be an agreement between the U.S. company and the consultant directly that defines what the consultant is going to do over the term of the engagement. I usually recommend start with the problem that the U.S. company is facing. So what is the challenge that the solar panel company is facing causing it to need a consultant? Our manufacturing process is too expensive. We need to become more efficient, faster at producing these, whatever it is. Define the challenge. Talk about how the consultant is the ideal person to address that challenge based on their background and experience. And then define the deliverables. So for the first 3 months, this consultant is going to review the data and observe our processes. For the next 3 months, they're going to make recommendations to management. And then for the final 3 months, they're going to actually observe the implementation. And they're going to be paid based on that as a contractor, not as a W-2 employee. Part of what I just said, if you noticed, the plan I laid out was 9 months. So typically for consultants, a 3-year engagement is quite long, so you might want to consider shortening it, not asking for the full 3 years, maybe ask for a year, maybe 2 years. Shorten that period and then clearly define what the consultant's going to do and how they're going to be paid for the deliverables over that period. So this, what I'm describing is really this last bullet. When you see the position must be supernumerary, that means it shouldn't be a permanent role at the U.S. employer. It needs to be a contracted extra role where you're coming in to address an issue and then you're out. So that's management consultants. Economists, this category is challenging for completely different reasons. Specifically, in 2017, the government issued a policy memo. And what that policy memo basically said is people are coming into the U.S. as TN economists, but they're working as financial analysts or market research analysts. And we don't want them to do that. We want, if someone's coming in as an economist, they need to work as an economist. So the takeaway is if you are coming into the U.S. as an economist, if you're applying to be a TN economist, you want to go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and you want to read those job duties, what they do for economists. Okay, so again, research economic issues, conduct surveys, collect data, analyze that, present it to management. You also, though, want to search OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook, financial analysts, and OOH, market research analysts, and see what they do. And you want to make sure your job duties are not what they do, are not what financial analysts or market research analysts do. You want to make sure your job duties are what economists do. In general, financial analysts are people employed by financial institutions to generate profits from investments. That's a very broad stroke description. So do look at those job duties on OOH. Market research analysts are really working in marketing, are finding ways for the employer to better market its goods or services. So those are two areas that you really should not submit a TN economist application to pursue. And the government is strict about that, so do be careful there. All right, we can go through this slide pretty quickly because I already covered it. The application process for Canadians, if they're outside the U.S., they can apply at a consulate or a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico, if they're outside the U.S., can only apply at a consulate, not a port of entry. And for nationals of Mexico or Canada who are inside the U.S., they can apply through USCIS, the change of status, and it's the employer who files that. What does the application include? So regardless of whether you're applying at a consulate, a port of entry, or USCIS, the supporting documentation is always going to look the same. It's going to start with a letter from the U.S. employer. And that letter is going to describe who the U.S. employer is, why they need someone in this profession to come into the U.S. to work for them, who the applicant is, the employee, how they qualify for the TN, why they're a good fit for the job, and then details on the job, how many years or months you intend to employ them, the employer intends to employ the employee in the U.S., what they're going to be paid, etc. That's what the employer letter is going to include. Next is proof of how the applicant qualifies, whether that is a degree, a professional license, or professional experience. If you're qualifying based on a degree, you'd have a copy of your diploma or your original diploma in the application. Possibly your transcript, as we talked about before. If you're qualifying based on experience, you need original letters from past employers talking about the fact that you have at least 5 years of relevant experience. So, Category 1, employer letter. Category 2, proof of how you qualify for the TN. Of course, you also need your passport. Many people ask, do I need proof of my ties abroad, ties to Canada or Mexico? Typically, no. If it's your first or second TN application, the government usually doesn't need to see ties, proof of your ties abroad, but it never hurts to have it. So maybe proof of that you have a bank account abroad that has a balance. If you have an apartment or a house abroad, it can be good to bring that along, but usually it's not required. One big difference is if you are applying at a port of entry or at a consulate, your documents need to be originals. So you need the original signed letter from the employer. You need the original diploma from your school if you're applying based on education. Certified copies of the transcripts. If you're qualifying based on experience, you need original signed letters from your past employers talking about the fact that you have that 5 years of experience. For USCIS, copies are fine. USCIS does not want to see originals. All right, and finally, some tips and common pitfalls before we turn to questions. Call ahead. If you're applying at a port of entry, call the port of entry ahead. Get a sense of when they're open, if there are any unique procedures that they have. It's always helpful to just get a sense before you show up in person. You can find phone numbers on the CBP website, and we're happy to help with that if you decide to work with us. Second, ensure the employer contact who signed the letter is available to answer a call in case the official calls to verify the job. So this is relevant, excuse me, if you're applying at a port of entry or at a consulate. Because sometimes you'll present the employer letter and the border officer or the consular officer will actually call the number of the person who signed the letter. Quick call just to make sure the job offer is legitimate. It doesn't happen often, but if it does happen, you do want to have that person ready to answer. So you can just tell them, hey, I plan to approach the port of entry tomorrow between 2 and 3 o'clock, 2 and 4 o'clock. If you could just have your phone on you, that'd be great. Third, bring your diploma, official transcripts, and original signed versions of the employer letter if possible. This is relevant at ports of entry or at consulates. Bring originals. And that's because ports of entry and consulates encounter a good amount of fraud. So copies, whenever they see copies, they think this could be fraudulent, so they want to see the originals. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. That means it's a temporary visa. So you do need to be prepared to explain that you plan to leave at the end of your TN visa. Again, it's not usually necessary to have proof of your ties abroad, but if you want to bring that along with you, it can't hurt. All right, let's turn to questions. I know a number of questions have come in. Economist working in a chemical company. So I think the question is, can you work at a chemical company in the TN economist category? The answer is it all comes down to your job duties. So if a chemical company needs to employ an economist, as long as your job duties are those of an economist, it's perfectly fine to work as an economist for any kind of company, including a chemical company. The important thing is that your job duties align and that you're actually working as an economist. Employers are not familiar with the TN, even though it does not require sponsorship. That is correct, and we are happy to talk with employers to explain it to them. We do that quite often. You can also point them to our webinars or our YouTube videos. We actually have YouTube videos specifically on the question of sponsorship for a TN. Management consultant for a chemical company. So I think this is asking, can I work as a management consultant for a chemical company? I read somewhere it's tough for in-house consulting positions versus a big four. this is exactly what I was talking about before, where there is a spectrum. If you're coming to the U.S. to work for a consulting company, not risky. If you're coming to the U.S. to work for a company that is not a consulting company, that's where you need to be careful and make the application strong. Make it clear that this is a legitimate consulting arrangement and not someone coming to the U.S. as a management consultant just because they don't have a degree. The first slide mentioned job offer should be for a specific time period. A permanent role does not have an end date. How does this clause work? Well, it works because in the employer letter, the letter has to specify how long you're requesting TN status for. When you go to the border, you have to tell them. They will ask you, okay, how long are you planning to come in for? You can't tell them forever. You're going to be denied because it's not a green card. The TN is a temporary visa, meaning that you need to leave at the end of the validity period of your status. That is a maximum of 3 years. So you need to talk with your employer and figure out, do you need the maximum allowable time, which is 3 years? If so, then ask for 3 years. If you don't need 3 years, it could strengthen the application by asking for 2 years or even 1 year, depending on the nature of the agreement. A TN can be renewed indefinitely as long as you and the U.S. employer remain eligible. So we have clients who have renewed their TN visas 3, 4, 5 times, so pushing over a decade of time. As long as your intention is not to pursue a green card, not to permanently remain in the U.S., you're just renewing the visa to continue your TN employment, that is fine. You can do that. But each time you apply for a TN, you need to specify how long you need the TN for, up to a maximum of 3 years. Can you elaborate on the extra role for management consultant? Should it be permanent or... okay, I think we talked about this. It cannot be permanent. So it needs to be supernumerary, meaning you're coming in as a consultant to address a specific challenge. Once that's done, you are done. Your engagement is done. Okay, if my degree is in finance and I wanted to work under the economist TN category, would I have to make sure if the role is related to the economist position or close to economist duties? The answer is yes. So if frankly, if your degree is in finance, that is, I would say that's a related degree. And I've worked with people who are applying for economist TN roles with finance degrees. It's usually not too hard to point to the caseload that you've carried as part of your degree. Usually people in finance have taken economics courses, so you'd emphasize those courses. You might want a letter from a professor or from a dean or from someone at the department, a department chair, talking about how your degree qualifies you to work as an economist. But this, I do think this is not fatal to the application. I think there are good arguments you can make as to why you qualify with a finance degree. But you would need to address that. I would not just say I'm applying as an economist with a degree in finance. I would actually reinforce it with your transcript. What would be the best way to vouch for oneself in explaining that they are TN eligible? To save time for both parties, I've reached out to HR directly asking if they take TN holders. Several times they said no. I asked because I had an offer from a job, but as soon as HR found I'm Canadian, they rejected the offers, or they retracted it. So now I figured I would call ahead of time to have that conversation. It's a really good question. It sounds like the employer, though, is open to a conversation, which is great. In that case, I mean, we have gotten on the phone with employers to explain it to them. That's probably the best option, is to have them talk with an immigration lawyer who can explain what the difference is. Because it is a huge difference. It actually does not require the employer to do anything extra except for sign a letter. They just have to sign a letter. It's usually 2 pages, 3 pages, talking about the role and why they need to employ you. So the requirements are minimal, and when employers understand that, they're usually open to it. Where people get into problems is when they're applying to a big company or a very bureaucratic company where you have to check a box. Do you require sponsorship, yes or no? And my recommendation is to answer no, because again, TNs don't require sponsorship. Could the employer say, well, you lied because you're not a U.S. citizen, you don't have work authorization? They could say that, but to me that's not, you haven't lied. You don't need sponsorship. So it prompts a conversation where you can say, I answered no because as a Canadian, I don't need you to sponsor me. I only need you to give me a letter, which I will then take to the border, or as a national of Mexico to the consulate, and I can get the visa. You don't have to sponsor me. But again, most helpful is usually for us to have a conversation with the employer. You can also point them to, we have blog posts on this topic. We have YouTube videos on this topic. I'm not sure if they'll watch a YouTube video, but again, if in the past it's been effective for us to actually have a call with the employer. Why would an employer select candidates from Canada or Mexico if there's uncertainty about the 3-year period? Well, the TN visa is one of the most popular visas, so clearly there is enormous demand for it in spite of 3 years. But frankly, this question could apply to any visa that's not a green card. The U.S. has tons of temporary work visas. H-1Bs bring in tens of thousands of workers every year. Those are temporary. The TN is temporary. The E2 is temporary. E1 is temporary. OPT is temporary. It is only green cards that are not temporary. And so this is really fundamental to how the U.S. economy works. The U.S. regularly brings in people. The U.S. employers regularly bring in people for brief periods. 3 years is actually not all that brief. Sometimes people are coming in even for a year. If you look at the H-1A, agricultural or H-2A, for example, agricultural workers. So plenty of employers find it helpful to bring in people for 3 years or less. And again, you can renew it. If you're a Canadian and you have used your 3 years, all you do is you get a new letter from the employer, you cross the border, come back in, and you get another 3 years. So it's no effort from the employer. It's easy to extend it that way. So it's quite popular. And I think for good reason. All right. So my degree is a PhD in chemical engineer, applying for a TN as a senior scientist to qualify under engineer or in the chemist category. So the way you would figure that out is you would first look at the profession. So what is it that you're coming into the U.S.? Are you coming into the U.S. to perform the job duties of an engineer or those of a chemist? I'm assuming that chemists, let's see. Yeah, so biochemists or chemists can also qualify. So you want to look at your job duties. You want to go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, look at the job duties that chemists perform, biochemists, as well as engineers. Engineers, there are many subcategories. So there could be chemical engineer as a subcategory. And you want to see which category is most closely aligned to your job duties, and then figure out if your degree qualifies you for that. I think as a chemical engineer, as a PhD in chemical engineering, you would likely qualify under any of those categories: engineer, chemist, or biochemist. So it would come down to the job duties. You'd figure out what job is closest to what you're actually excuse me, doing in the U.S. MBA plus accounting designation would work for an accounting TN like a CMA. I would say an MBA is a related degree. It's not an accounting degree. But if you have significant coursework, as it sounds like you do, in accounting, then I think there's a very good argument to be made that you qualify as an accountant. You just need to make that argument in the application while citing to your transcript. What I mean by that is include your transcript, and actually in the letter list out the names of the accounting courses you completed, and emphasize that this was part of your degree, was to focus on accounting. And I do think that's a viable application. All right, well, those were excellent questions. Thank you all for taking the time. Please do sign up for other webinars. Schedule a consultation if you want to talk about your specific circumstances. And of course, we would be happy if you want to work with us. We'd be happy to send you an engagement letter and get the process started. The TN, again, it really is one of the top 2 visas that we help our clients navigate, and for good reason. It's extremely convenient for both the employee and the U.S. employer. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you all so much. Stay well and have a great day. Thanks.